Okay, let's get started on the last chapter we're going to cover, and that's chapter 14, how biological diversity evolves. So this is going to be more on what's called macroevolution, that is speciation, how species become other species, and as opposed to microevolution, which is small allele frequency changes from generation to generation. And that was more of a subject of the last chapter. Now we're going on to speciation. Where did all this biological diversity come from, and the mechanisms involved? So 100 million years of rock history is written in the layers of rock in the Grand Canyon. Remember, the fossil record is very consistent all across the world. The deeper you go, the farther back in time you go. And the organisms that are found in those layers are consistent across the entire world. And then it talks about humanity has had extraordinary effect on the ecology and geology of the earth. Transport of organisms far from their natural homes, introduced organisms, agriculture and domesticated animals, manufactured materials, radioactivity, and climate-altering emissions from burning fossil fuels, climate change. So the reversibility of these changes, I think that we've started a new epoch in history called the Anthropocene, which is the time of human beings. Significant shift in the geologic record includes a high rate of extinction and an accelerating change to Earth. So as I mentioned before, we've had 5 major natural extinctions over the course of the history of life on Earth. Now we're in the middle of the 6th, and it's thought to be human-driven. And human-driven changes in the environment also bring about change in the population of organisms, including pesticide-resistant insects and antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So we're changing the environment around us. Okay, waste residue from mining sands in Alberta, Canada. Okay, the origin of species. 150 years or so since the publication of Darwin's book on the origin of species by natural selection, new discoveries and technological advances have given scientists a wealth of new information about the evolution of life on Earth. So the diversity of the life evolved through speciation, the process in which one species splits into 2 or more species. Here's a unique species of organism in the Galapagos, the marine iguana. It's the only iguana on Earth that's marine, and it dives down and eats algae. Okay, so species is Latin word mean kind or appearance. So what is a species? It's defined by the biological species concept. Defines a species as a group of populations. A group of populations. It's a species, is a population whose members have the potential to interbreed with one another in nature and produce fertile offspring. That is, offspring that can reproduce and make the same type of species. It's not a perfect concept because can't be applied in all situations because of asexual organisms. Some organisms don't use sex, so they don't interbreed. So that doesn't apply to them. So in fossils, of course, you can't define an extinct species because they interbreed, because you never saw them interbreed. Okay. So with those organisms, you have to measurable physical traits, molecular data, small group of individuals sharing common ancestors. You have to use other characteristics to identify asexual organisms and extinct organisms. Like in bacteria, it's often chemical tests, different metabolic tests will distinguish one species from the next. Because if you look at all rod bacteria look kind of the same. All toxic bacteria look the same, and you can't tell with, and they don't, and usually they breed asexually, so you can't use this species concept for that. So there's similarities, a similarity between different species. Those are actually two different species of birds. And then there's diversity within one species. You can see all kinds of diversity within one species. So there's an incredible amount of diversity around. So according to the biological species concept, what defines a species? As I said, it's a population of organisms that can interbreed with each other naturally in nature and produce offspring that are fertile offspring. So a reproductive barrier is anything that prevents individuals of closely related species from interbreeding or distantly related species. And this is important because, like I said, usually, it's what's the biggest mistake for an organism. The biggest force in nature for organisms is to pass on their genes. And so you got to make a viable offspring that can also interbreed in order to pass on your genes. So the biggest mistake you can make, and it makes you a really loser in the evolutionary game, is mating with a member of a different species, because you're not going to be passing on your genes. All right. So there are mechanisms that organisms have used to prevent that really serious error, and these are called reproductive barriers. All right. Prezygotic barriers prevents the mating or fertilization between species. So that is, remember what a zygote is? It's a fertilized egg. So prezygotic barriers prevent a zygote from ever being made. All right, prevents mating from happening, and therefore from fertilization from happening. So you don't even make a zygote. Postzygotic barriers operate if interspecies mating can occur, okay, and a zygote might be made, and also that when hybrid zygotes are made. So sometimes postzygotic, mating can occur, but you still don't make a zygote. So it's called postzygotic, which implies that a zygote is being made, but not always. Sometimes mating can occur in this incompatibility between the egg and the sperm. But sometimes a zygote is made, a hybrid zygote is made. And then we have, and that's a real, and then there are things that prevent that hybrid from getting born and being fertile and being strong. So why is behavioral isolation considered a prezygotic barrier? Well, you can't mate if you live thousands of miles apart, right? So there's not going to be mating there because you don't live in the, because we can talk about tigers and lions. You can make ligers and tyons, depending upon whether the male of this mating was a lion or a tiger, and the female is a lion or a tiger. But that's artificial. They make a hybrid offspring, but in nature that would never happen. Why? Well, lions live in Africa, and tigers don't live in Africa. Tigers live in Asia, and lions don't live in Asia. They're thousands of miles apart. It's a behavioral isolation. It would never happen in nature. It just happens in zoos and enclosures where people put the two animals together. Okay, so here are all these reproductive barriers, and we're going to first show you this slide with all of them on there, and then we're going to go through each one in turn and give examples of each one. So, so there's individuals of different species. Here's a prezygotic barrier: temporal isolation, habitat isolation, and behavioral isolation. So we'll go through those. Then what if you have a mating attempt? Then you can have mechanical isolation and gametic isolation. And then what if you do have mating and a zygote forms? Then you have these post-zygotic barriers. And so, well, this contradicts the last slide. The last slide put these mating attempts here as post-zygotic, but they're pre-zygotic. Reduced hybrid viability, reduced hybrid fertility, hybrid breakdown. And then there are no barriers to making viable fertile offspring. So let's look at these in turn. Okay, temporal isolation, pre-zygotic barriers. So two different skunk species, they mate at different times. Right? They mate at different times. So then, human beings are a little unusual because we mate all year round. But a lot of organisms just mate at a particular time of the year, and that's it. And they never think about having sex other times. Like deer in the wedding season for deer in the fall. That's when males and females get together and mate. They don't do it in the summer or the spring or the winter. And this too for all species. Like I had a house in West Virginia where I had a pond out in front, and there would be every spring there would be amphibian orgies in that pond. The first one would be the wood frogs. I mean, there'd be still ice on a pond, and they're mating and making eggs. Then the green frogs would come up, and it'd be their time to mate, and they make their eggs. And then they're following the spring peepers. They would be the latest ones. So from really early spring to mid-spring to late spring. So that's temporal isolation. Habitat isolation. Two different species of snake. One lives in the water, one's terrestrial. They're not going to find each other. They're not going to be in the same place at the same time. Behavior isolation. There's two blue-footed boobies. They are dancing with each other. And you have to do a certain behavioral thing, like a dance. A lot of birds have dances. So you got to do the right dance. And if you don't do it right, you're not getting any action. You won't be mating with me because you're doing the wrong dance. You've got to be a different species, right? And this is true for also the frogs I was talking about. The males are calling to attract females, where every species has a different call. All right. And so females are not going to be attracted to a call of a different species, only to the males of their species. Right? Same thing with fireflies. Fireflies flash at a particular frequency at a species-specific rate, and other fireflies maybe around the same time, but they have a different flashing rate, and so that's behavioral isolation. Mechanical isolation. Okay, the parts won't fit together. You can't have mating because the reproductive organs don't fit together, right? A hummingbird can't have offspring with the flower that's trading in. And this a better example of that would be some orchids whose flowers are shaped like the female genitals of a particular insect. And the male, and it gives off even pheromones that are pheromones of the insect that the male detects. And he comes and he tries to mate with the flower because he thinks it's a female member of his species. And in doing so, he pollinates that flower. So this is the idea that orchids are tricking the bees into trying to mate with them so they'll pollinate their flowers. But of course, they can't mate because their parts don't fit together. Okay, then gametic isolation. This happens a lot in a sea urchin here. There's a means of getting gametes together called dispersal. No, what is it called? broadcast. So different species of sea urchins just broadcast their gametes into the ocean. Just send them all out, you know, and good luck, guys. So billions of eggs and billions of sperm from all different sea urchin species. Well, why don't we get hybrids? Because it's a molecular recognition between the egg of my species and the sperm of my species. They recognize each other by this molecular recognition. These proteins that fit together, and then fertilization can occur. If it's an egg of one urchin species and a sperm of another urchin species, those proteins don't fit together, and so it's like a molecular mechanical isolation. Those proteins have to fit together, and they don't, and so we don't make hybrid offspring. So those are pre-zygotic barriers. Okay. Okay. What happens if the parts do fit together? And fertilization actually occurs. You actually make a zygote. Best example is horses and donkeys make mules. But mules are sterile, so that's reduced hybrid fertility. Mules are sterile. They can't make more mules by mating with other mules or by mating with donkeys or horses. They can't do it if they're sterile. Okay. Then there's reduced hybrid viability. There's a salamander who's a hybrid, and it's not viable. It dies early in life and doesn't last long enough to try and make a mating attempt. And then there's hybrid breakdown. The hybrid species are really weak, and they fall over if it's a plant, and they just can't make. They're really sickly, and they can't really make it. It's very similar to reduced hybrid viability. So those are post-zygotic barriers. Okay, a key event in the origin of a species occurs when a population is somehow cut off from other populations of the same species. So species can form by, and this could be a geographic cutoff or like a behavioral cutoff. So species can form what's called allopatric speciation, in which the initial block to gene flow is a geographical barrier that physically isolates the splintered population. Or sympatric speciation, without geographic isolation, some other kind of behavioral or ecological thing separates two parts of the same population. And that would be like a disruptive selection, which I mentioned in the last lecture, where we got big seeds and small seeds, and birds with the bigger beaks like the bigger seeds, and the ones with the small beaks like the smaller seeds, and then and they start drifting away and eating different things and living in different places, and that could be sympatric speciation. Okay, but let me give you a good example of allopatric first, because allopatric is easier to understand than sympatric. A variety of geological processes can isolate populations. Speciation occurs with the evolution of reproductive barriers between the isolated population and its parent population. So then, if they're separated for long enough and microevolution occurs, then and they're separated for a long period of time, even if the two populations should come back together, contact at some time, some kind of reproductive barrier has been established, and they will keep them as separate species. So what is necessary for actual allopatric speciation to occur? You have to have some kind of geographical separation. Okay, and here is with the Grand Canyon. So one time the Grand Canyon was in there, and there's one species of one population of squirrels of one species, and then the Colorado River started cutting the canyon, and now you got two isolated populations of the same species, and they're geographically isolated. They can't cross that Grand Canyon and get to mate with the squirrel on the other side of the canyon. And even if they did, if you put them together, they might not mate. So this is how you can tell, for example, I always use squirrels as an example. So you look in this tree and you see a gray squirrel. And then one other time in the same tree, you see a red squirrel. And thinking, hey, is this two different species? Because remember, we saw earlier differences in appearance between different species, and then difference within the same species. And sometimes the difference within the same species can be really huge. And remember, this is particularly between genders, like sexual dimorphism. So then, how can you tell whether this gray squirrel and this red squirrel are different species? Well, you have to be kind of like squirrel voyeurs. You gotta see whether they mate with each other. If the grays don't mate with the reds and vice versa, they're different species. Right? And like I said, sometimes and this is true because sometimes you could have a species with very different color variations. Like there's a yellow swallowtail butterfly, and usually they're very yellow and have a little bit of black. But then there's the black variety that there's almost all black and yellow, but they're the same species. They seem to mate together, so they're the same species. And sometimes males can live within right next to a female, like spiders. Usually the big spider that's sitting in the web is a female, and the male is this tiny little guy that comes along and tries to mate with a huge female. Sometimes it's really extreme. I think one kind of clam or something has the male exists within the shell of the female. It's this tiny little thing that just exists as a sperm bank for the female. So there could be a lot of variability. Okay. So possible outcomes after geographic isolation of population. Populations become allopatric with a geographical barrier, and then that geographical barrier then is gone, and they come back together. If they still interbreed with each other, macroevolution speciation has not occurred, but if they come together and they won't mate, then speciations occur. So let me show you an example of that. On the board here, because this is one way I talk about allopatric speciation. So you have this geographical area, and you got these individuals all over the place of a particular species. All right? And they can go anywhere. They can go here or they can there. So these two can mate, those two can mate. They can go all over the place. But what happens if we have an orogeny right in the middle of the population? Now, it sounds almost sexual, but it isn't. It means mountain building. So you have these mountains start to rise up right in the middle of the population. This is what happened in the Rocky Mountains. Somehow the Rocky Mountains are actually still getting taller. Something up in the mantle of the earth is pushing the earth up there and making the Rocky Mountains. Okay, so these are the Rockies, for example. Here is west, here's east. Now, our weather comes from the west, across the country to the east. So these clouds come over and they hit the Rocky Mountains. So, okay, before we can say that, so now these individuals cannot cross these steep mountains, these high mountains. They can't cross them. So two sides of the population are geographically isolated from each other. Okay. The clouds come from the west, hit the Rocky Mountains, and they get pushed up to try to go over the Rocky Mountains. Well, here's the thing. It gets colder and colder the higher you go, and the colder and colder the cloud gets, the less and less moisture it can hold. So it's moisture laden when it hits the Rocky Mountains, but when it goes up, it drops its water load on this side of the of the Rocky Mountains. This is called the windward side. And so this side of the mountains gets a lot of rainfall, and you get a thick, almost temperate rainforest on the western side of the Rocky Mountains. So then the clouds get over, and by the time they get over, they've dropped most of their load of water. So now they have very little water left in them. So there's much less waterfall on what's called the leeward side of the mountains. So it's much drier, and it becomes this grassland because there's not enough water to support trees. Grass needs a lot less water than trees. So it becomes a grassland over here. So now these organisms are living in a temperate rainforest. These are living in a grassland. And does microevolution occur? Well, yeah. Remember, maybe not on all loci. Remember, some of the loci in the genomes of these individual animals might be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and they're not changing. The allele frequencies aren't changing from one generation to the next. But there are going to be a lot of loci that are, the allele frequencies are changing, particularly for alleles that will help these organisms on this side adapt to a grassland environment. All right, they used to live in forest. Now that's become a grassland because of these mountains. So natural selection is going to work to select alleles that help these organisms live in a grassland, a prairie environment. But these organisms over here, they're living in a temperate rainforest. So microevolution is going to occur over here. I mean, microevolution always occurs. Not at every locus, but at a lot of loci. And so the changes, the traits you need to live in a temperate rainforest is really different than the traits you need, the alleles you need to live in a grassland. So very different selection is going to occur on this side for alleles that help you live in a temperate rainforest. So millions of years are going to pass, and microevolutions, very different types of microevolution are going to occur on both sides of the mountains. Okay, what happens to mountains? They eventually erode, right? The Appalachian Mountains that we live around here used to be as high as the Rockies, but like a quarter of a billion years ago. But they've eroded down to hills now. They're really called mountains, but most of them are really just hills. The highest one is Cleveland's Dome. It's only 6,000 feet high, while in the Rockies we get 14,000. Okay, so they will erode down now to like maybe just little hills. All right. Okay, now these animals can actually can go over these hills. They can go from one part to the next if they wanted to. They can cross it. So they're not geographically isolated anymore. But are they reproductively isolated? If one of these individuals crosses it and goes over it and comes into contact with this population, will they mate with each other? If they still mate with each other, they're still the same species, and speciation hasn't occurred. But if they won't mate with each other, for whatever reason, could be a behavioral isolation, a temporal isolation, whatever, some reproductive barrier has been erected, then they have become different species by definition. And this is how species event and allopatric speciation could occur. All right. Okay. So how about sympatric speciation? A new species arises within the same geographic area as its parent species. And factors that can reduce gene flow in sympatric species include what's called polyploidy, in which species may originate from an accident during cell division that results in an extra set of chromosomes. Now that's usually, the aneuploidies usually cause huge problems and cause miscarriages and everything. It just doesn't work. They're not viable. But sometimes they are. Not that often in animals. It's really rare in animals. But in plants, it's more likely to be okay, to still result in an organism that's viable. Habitat complexity, as I mentioned, the different seeds, that could lead to allopatric species. Sexual selection could do that. A certain number of species in one part of the population start preferring males that look a different way. And the other females in the other part of the population, they're not attracted to males like that. So now females start causing really changes in the males, and it can become really different species. Okay, two distinct forms of polyploid speciation have been occurred. One form, polyploidy. So polyploidy means more than diploid. Haploid is one set of chromosomes. Diploid is two sets of chromosomes. Triploid or tetraploid is 3 or 4 sets of chromosomes. A failure of cell division might double the chromosome number from the original diploid number, 2n, to 4n. A second form of polyploid speciation can grow when two different species interbreed and produce hybrid offspring. And in these cases, the hybrids are viable. So many of the plant species we grow for food are polyploids, including oats, potatoes, bananas, strawberries, peanuts, apples, sugarcane, and wheat. And here's a gray tree frog, which is actually a really rare thing. I think it's a tetraploid animal. So that's really rare. The Chinese hibiscus, which is also, I think, tetraploid. So here's how this could happen. Species A, 2n is 4. Species B, 2n is 6. Gametes for species A n is 2. Gamete for species B is 3. They have a hybrid fertilization, so there's no a zygotic barrier here. There's no pre or post zygotic barrier. They make well, there is a barrier. The hybrid is sterile, n is 5, but it can reproduce asexually. So if it reproduces asexually, then it doubles its chromosome, and it makes a new species, this viable fertile hybrid species, where 2n is now 10. And it's a different species. Okay. So as humans travel, we often transplant plants and animals and organisms to regions beyond the natural range, and they create opportunities for hybridization that would not otherwise exist. Like I said, tigers or tyons or ligers, lions and tigers that mate. That, like I said. So 50 years after the introduction of a plant goat speed, a lot of the weeds around on the roadside, they're all introduced organisms from other places. Almost none of them are native. So 50 years after the introduction of plant goat speed to the United States, the botanists discovered that a hybridization had produced 2 species. Okay. They supported the hypothesis that this originated by polyploid speciation. It's an example of, I'm not going to go through. You're not going to need to know exactly how they did these experiments and how they figured it out. We got other things we got to talk about. Okay. Volcanic islands, since the Galapagos and Hawaiian Islands are initially devoid of life. Over time, colonists arrive via ocean currents or winds. In a new environment, these populations might diverge significantly from their parent populations. And islands have been physically diverse habitats and are far apart enough to permit population to evolve in isolation, but close enough to allow occasional dispersals to occur on the sites of multiple species events. So islands are real areas of rapid speciation, of adaptive radiations, usually, like in the Galapagos. So that's one of the great showcases of speciation. There's 14 species of closely related finches. I mentioned these finches before. They share very many finch-like traits, but they differ in their feeding habits, their habitats, their beaks, which have been specialized for what they eat. So the distinctive Beaks adapted for specific diets of different species of finch are an example of the correlation between structure and function. So you get a cactus seed eater, a cactus finch, a tool using insect eater, a woodpecker finch, an insect eater, warbler finch. When in the mainland of South America, you really just have finches that eat big seeds. They don't have these different ecological niches. So in contrast to microevolutionary change, which may be apparent within a few generations, the process of speciation is usually extremely slow. You can't see it happening. But we can see some speciation occurring. So researchers have documented at least 24 cases in which populations occurring diverging as they use different food resources or breed in different habitats. So much of the evidence for evolution comes from the fossil record. In one survey of 84 groups of plants and animals, the time for speciation ranged from 4,000 to 40 million years. And the cumulative effects of multiple speciations, as well as extinctions, have shaped the dramatic changes documented in the fossil record. So macroevolution is evolutionary change above the species level. It includes the impact of mass extinctions on the diversity of life and the origin of key adaptations such as flight. So an understanding of macroevolution begins with a look at the span of geologic time over which life's diversity has evolved. Fossils are evidence of organisms that lived in the past. The fossil record is a sequence in which fossils appear in rock strata and an archive of macroevolution. The geological timescale divides Earth's history into a consistent sequence of geological periods. So this strata of sedimentary rock at the Grand Canyon. And remember, you only find fossils in sedimentary rock. So there's a geological time frame. Now, I'm not going to have you memorize, you don't have to memorize all of these different eras and all these different periods and how long ago they were, but just look at its consistency of the organisms found in these different areas. Where you have first the first evolution of multicellular organisms, then you have early vascular plants, then you have bony fishes, the first vertebrates, and then you have amphibians evolving from those, some early ancient insects. Then have vascular plants that have circulatory systems evolving. And then you have this mass extinction in the Permian, and then you have the dinosaur period, and also flowering plants. Dinosaurs and flowering plants are about as old. They started evolving in the same era, the Mesozoic era, about 60, 70 million years ago. And then after dinosaurs died out, you had this major speciation of mammals, birds, and pollinated insects, mammal orders, primates finally evolving, and then a species of mammals and angiosperms, which are flowering plants. And then you have origin of genus Homo, and our arrival on the scene really only about 200,000 years ago. Well, this has 500,000 years ago, but modern humans maybe about 200,000 years ago. Okay. The most common method geologists use to learn the age of rocks and fossils is radiometric dating. Method based on the decay of radioactive isotopes, which often have half-lives in the millions and billions of years. And you can't use carbon dating because it's not accurate after just 50,000 years. Another commonly used method is to date layers of volcanic rock or ash above and a sedimentary layer in which fossils are formed. By the inference, the age of fossils is between those two dates. Okay, plate tectonics. So according to the theory of plate tectonics, the continents and seafloors form a thin outer layer of solid rock called the crust, divided up in giant irregular shaped plates that float atop the mantle. Massive hot viscous material is continental drift. At one time they thought, the guy who came up with this idea, Alfred Wegener, they thought it was crazy. Continents moving? Well, they do. And then the boundaries of some plates are hotspots of geological activity, and earthquakes signal that two plates are scraping past or colliding with each other. So here's a cutaway view of Earth. We live in a very thin crust of soil and rock on the outside, and the mantle, the outer core, and the inner core. So there are all the Earth's tectonic plates. And on that note, I think I should call it, because it's getting long. So this is going to be 106 diversity 1. And I should be able to finish this chapter with one more video lecture. So let's call it here, and I'll catch you later.